much for coming, and thank you for braving the rain and the traffic to come tonight. My name is Erica Lee. I'm a professor of history and Asian American Studies, and I'm also the director of the Immigration History Research Center, where we'll be going at 7:30 tonight for the reception and book signing. The program tonight, Global Minnesota, Immigrants Past and Present, is part of our year-long series that is really aimed at producing and facilitating conversations about immigration. It's part of a National Endowment for the Humanities grant, Humanities in the Public Square. This is a brand new grant, and the aim of the program is to bring the humanities into the public square and foster innovative ways to make scholarship relevant to contemporary issues. And the Immigration History Research Center is just one of 21 institutions that received this grant this year. So this is the last event for the semester. We had a kickoff event a few weeks ago, but we will have major public forums like this one next fall. And over the summer, we'll also continue the conversations about immigration through a variety of public programming. We'll have neighborhood walking tours. We're working with immigrants and refugees to create their own immigrant stories. We'll have spoken word workshops, film screenings, and discussions. For any educators out there, we're also holding 2 summer institutes on migration and digital storytelling, and you can find that on our website. We hope that you'll join us for these featured conversations because, as you know, immigration around the United States and around the world is one of the central issues that is really transforming communities, transforming nations, transforming national and global dialogues. You can find more about our events on our Facebook page. There will also be evaluation forms. You should have picked one up when you registered, so please be sure to fill that out, and you can turn them in the baskets that are outside. So I am so excited to have the opportunity to have this event tonight. This is a dream panel of community experts and scholars, as well as one of my very favorite authors, Kalia Yang, and her new book that's launching tonight, The Song Poet. And as you know, the topic of our conversation, refugee resettlement, could not be more timely. We are living in the midst of a global humanitarian crisis. A record number of people have been forced from their homes due to wars, conflict, persecution in Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and Europe. The UN published statistics late last year. A record number of people, 59.5 million people, or 1 in every 122 people, is currently either a refugee, internally displaced, or seeking asylum. That's 1 in 122 people around the world. And the prognosis for the future is anything but positive. Decades of instability and conflict in places like Afghanistan and Somalia have created generations of people on the move, or stranded in refugee camps at the margins of society. Syria is currently the largest producer of internally displaced people and refugees who have fled their homeland, and experts predict that the scale of global forced displacement will only continue and may be the new normal, that this is not an exception, but actually a new normal. As communities, local and national governments, international organizations, and political economic unions engage in a ferocious debate about how to respond, it's important to remember that Minnesota has a long history of refugee resettlement as part of the U.S.'s role of resettling refugees. The brutal crackdown on Hungarian students protesting against communist rule in 1956 led to an outpouring of 200,000 refugees. Both Canada and the U.S. took in more than 40,000 each. Years of war created millions of displaced people in Southeast Asia. After the war ended in 1975, those who fought on the side of the Americans in Vietnam and Laos were targeted for political persecution and re-education, and in Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge genocide created even more refugees. Since 1975, the U.S. has resettled more than 1.2 million people from Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And I always tell my students this, some of whom are in the audience right now, but I always say this is a very important fact. that from April to December of 1975, the United States resettled 130,000 refugees from Vietnam in that short window, all on its own, before we really had a comprehensive refugee resettlement policy. So it's important to remember what we can do when the United States has the will to do so. Vice President Walter Mondale played a crucial role in increasing the U.S.'s role in responding to the humanitarian crisis after he visited refugee camps in Thailand in 1977, so another Minnesota roots. The Carter-Mondale administration convinced the United Nations to convene a special refugee convention in 1979 to propose an international solution to the crisis. Walter Mondale addressed the convention himself, the conference himself, and he concluded his speech with these words: "History will not forgive us if we fail. History will not forget us if we succeed." And most recently, Minnesota has resettled Somalis, the first who came to the Twin Cities as immigrants in the 1980s, and then as refugees after 1993, after that country's still ongoing civil war began. It's estimated that there are now 90,000 Somalis in Minnesota alone. According to the U.S. Office of Refugee Resettlement, Minnesota received over 2,000 refugees from 24 different countries in 2014 alone. Nearly half of those arrived from Somalia and a third from Myanmar, nearly all belonging to the Karen ethnic group, which faces persecution from that country's regime. The other refugees hail from Iraq, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan, and Ukraine. So helping us understand Minnesota's role resettling refugees in the United States are a number of esteemed guests, community experts, and scholars. And again, they're my dream team. We've been thinking and planning this event for many months, and they were the first ones who called, and thankfully for us, they answered. We'll first have a conversation with our panel of experts. We're going to have a brief break. This would be a wonderful time to buy books that are for sale out in the foyer, and we're pleased to be partnering with the U of M bookstore to do that. We'll then directly turn to Kalkalia Yang's book, A Reading of the Song Poet, an author discussion with Professor Mai Na Lee. That's all going to still be right here in this room. And then following the book reading, which will end around 8:30, we're going to, hopefully it's not going to be raining, we're just going to move across that little part of the plaza this way to the left and go to Anderson Library, where there's going to be dessert waiting for you and some drinks, and we will have tables set up for book signings. So first, our panelists, let me introduce them. First will be László Fülöp. Raised in Hungary, László was conscripted to a forced labor division in Komló and Budapest in 1954 through 1955. He took an active role in the revolution of 1956 and then fled to Austria in January of 1957. He studied architecture in Vienna and also here at the University of Minnesota. He worked in private practice and eventually became Director of Planning and Construction at the University of Minnesota and later at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. With his wife, Agnes, Fülöp has been a long-time leader of the Association of Minnesotan Hungarians. He has served as Vice President in the Hungarian-American Coalition, President of the Community of Hungarian Friends, and he is also a member of the American-Hungarian Federation. Second will be Professor Mai Na Lee, Associate Professor of History and Asian American Studies here at the University of Minnesota. She is a scholar of Highland Southeast Asia and the Southeast Asian diaspora community. Her book, which is on sale out in the foyer, Dreams of the Hmong Kingdom, was published this past year by the University of Wisconsin Press. And it examines how the Hmong negotiated for autonomy at the margins of expanding empires and contentious states during the French colonial era. Our last presenter on our panel is Abdi Roble. He's Executive Director of the Somali Documentary Project, an archive based on his documentary work and collection of historical manuscripts, postcards, and photographs of Somalia around the globe in the past century. He uses art and photography to advocate for human rights, social justice, and civic engagement, and he leads various efforts around the world to create awareness for Somali refugees and internally displaced people. He's co-author of the book, The Somali Diaspora, A Journey Away, which is also for sale out in the foyer. It was published by the University of Minnesota Press in 2008. In 2012, he was honored as one of 14 champions of change by the White House, and last month he was named one of the Bush Foundation Fellows for 2016-2018. So please help me welcome our esteemed panelists, and we'll start the conversation. Thank you.
Hello, I'm László Fülöp, and I was born in a small town in Hungary, in Central Europe. As a young boy with my family, I survived the devastating World War II, and during this long time of war, or at least so it seemed, Hungary's territory was devastated and indeed robbed by several armies. After my elementary school years, my family moved to another town called Szent Endre, which means Saint Andrew. It's a very old town, and very much appreciated to be there. Close to the north side, this is located close to the north side of the war-devastated Budapest, and the capital. I lived and studied and graduated eventually from high school in the Franciscan High School of St. Andrew. My father was a noted lawyer, and he was the president of a district court for the city of St. Andrew and its vicinity. The communists took over Hungary in about after the war. The war ended in 1945, and they took over power in Hungary in 1947-48. And about 3 years later, one of the powerful communist leaders in Hungary, the so-called Pest County party leader. Pest County is Budapest, is one of the important counties, just like Hennepin County in Minnesota. This party leader called up my father and told him that it came to their attention that certain people in my father's district were working against folk democracy. That's what they call themselves, folk Democrats. And they wanted these people arrested, convicted, and sentenced them to prison. The names were dictated over by the telephone by another party member. After my father and the chief prosecutor had the proper and lawful investigations conducted in each case, after about 5 months of police investigations, all accusations turned out to be false. Because of the delay of about a year that my father, where he dodged the so-called arresting these people, because he was unwilling to put innocent people in jail. He was charged and convicted for hiding and harboring the enemies of folk democracy. He was convicted in a court for 3 years. Now, shorter than 2 years later, he was rehabilitated and set free. But during these times, in spite of my good grades and successful entrance exams at several high school, higher education facilities, universities or colleges, as a consequence of my father's conviction, I became a politically unreliable person. And I was not accepted to any university or any college in Hungary. Instead of attending a university, I worked at factories. When I turned 20, I was drafted and transferred to a regiment of 1,600 other politically unreliable 20-year-olds who were taken, I was part of them, to South Hungary and to a town called Komló. And why I'm naming this town is that it had one of the most dangerous coal mines in the entire Europe. And so at the end of World War II, due to the agreement of the victorious powers, the Soviet military was supposed to leave Hungary 6 months following their vacating Austria, which happened in early 1955. But 2 Soviet divisions still remained in Hungary after the agreed upon time limit. In 10 years of the Soviet imposed and harshly executed Bolshevist ruling in Hungary, the country could not tolerate and bear the Soviet-guided, communist-dictated, terroristic oppression, and no longer. And on 1956, October 23, that will be 60 years ago this fall, a spontaneous uprising and revolution started in Budapest. The movement began by university students, and the country's atmosphere being very receptive, quickly spread to almost everywhere in Hungary. The communist government, as the Soviet armies, helped to crush the revolt and freedom fight. The retaliation came fast, and in the fight, as we called it, 5 days of fight and 5 days of freedom. Budapest was badly damaged again. A considerable number of the country's rebel populace escaped to the west, fearing the revenge of the communist leadership. I had participated in the daily events of the freedom fight in Budapest and in my hometown, St. Andrew, but I never used any weapons. So I wanted to study to be an architect. So after the revolution was crushed and the university enrollment policies did not change, I decided to escape to Austria, following many thousands of others, and hoping that I would be accepted to the Technical University in Vienna. Most Austrians sympathized with the Hungarian struggle and were helpful in providing basic needs, food, shelter, necessary transportation, or medical care to most needy refugees. The most important for me was feeling safe and hope for opportunities to build, if needed, a new life for myself. Of course, I missed my parents and friends, and I was homesick for quite a long time. In Austria, I visited my sister and her family, also my brother, in a camp near Salzburg, which is Western Austria, who had escaped almost 2 months before I did. They had received invitations from other family members already in the United States, and so they applied for migration to the US. In 1957, late April, they arrived to Minnesota and eventually settled down in Minneapolis. As most of us Hungarian refugees, we were reverential and very thankful for any little help received. After arriving to Vienna in early February, I was guided to the university and registered and was accepted and began studies in the School of Architecture at the Technische Hochschule, or Technical High School as they called it, but it's a very well-regarded university. Similarly to other refugee students, I received a conditional scholarship. Because of the time of the year, I was part of a group of refugees who were accommodated in an institutional camp in suburban Vienna. After my first successful exams in a foreign language, I was very proud of myself. Reluctantly, I yielded to my sister and brother's repeated requests and applied to immigrate to the United States. After several days of thorough examinations at the U.S. Embassy, my application was accepted to immigrate to the United States, and in late August, I received the airplane ticket to my big trip. Following a thorough check in New York, after a couple of days, I was approved to travel to my relatives, and I embarked on a long and adventurous trip with $6 and a train ticket in my pocket. In another couple of days, I arrived to Minneapolis, joining my sister and her family. We lived in a small apartment on Chicago Avenue, 38th and Chicago. And my family of 5 persons got much help from the local church members, also from some former Hungarian migrant refugees who had come here after World War II. For example, a gentleman called Paul Kirchner, he was an assistant prof of the English department of the university, gave us free English lessons, attended by quite a few new refugees in the evenings, twice a week, in a space that was loaned to us by the YMCA. So they also participated. Our family received a friendly helping hand from a very nice Norwegian-American lady, Ebba Kurz, who took us under her wings. She taught me how to drive a car. A man who met at the church when hearing that I wanted to become an architect took me to the architectural firm of Fast, Hillstrom & Horty in downtown Minneapolis, where I was hired to work for $1 an hour, part-time, during my school year, or school years, and full-time after graduation. I studied the English language very diligently because I wanted to be understood and be eligible and acceptable to start my studies at the University of Minnesota. We, the Hungarian refugees, were relatively poor beginners. We had to learn a new language and work full-time to assure a normal life. We all were very grateful for receiving support and help in our lives. We did not feel left out or pushed away. Indeed, the inclusion and acceptance gave us needed encouragement to become useful in our new lives, in our new society. My graduate sister and brother-in-law, who had a PhD in economics, worked very hard also. My sister worked in the Swedish hospital laundry, also for $1 an hour, and my brother-in-law in the office of Pillsbury Company for $290 per month. They were able to provide a stringent but normal living for the company, for the family, that included my high school-age brother and their little daughter, and at the beginning included me too. After 5 years, I graduated from the University of Minnesota as an architect. I became a U.S. citizen in 1963. I married an American girl in 1962. With my wife, we raised 3 wonderful children. Unfortunately, she passed away at the age of 50, and I remarried, this time a Hungarian widow. To my great luck, she turned out to be a loving mother to my children and grandchildren. I was trying to work hard and learn my profession and also recognize adjustments needed to parallel my social situation. About 4 or 5 years, in about 4 or 5 years, I became an associate at the Baker Associate Architects Inc. downtown, holding considerable responsibility, using my best knowledge which I needed as a downtown architect. Later, I was teaching architectural subjects in a community college and became a manager of design in the central office of Minnesota State Universities. In 1975, 1980 to 1983, I became the director of campus development, planning, and construction at the University of Minnesota. And from 1983 to 1990, I became a similar director at the campus development of the University of Wisconsin in Madison. After 1990, I opened my private office along with a career friend for about 15 years until my retirement. I have never cut off the connection with Hungary, mostly with my relatives and friends, and which has become a much easier and normal effort in the past 20 years, after the last occupying Soviet Russian soldiers left the country and Hungary finally became indeed democratic, free country in 1992. This was the time and condition we had fought for in 1956, that is 60 years ago. I am still grateful for the acceptance and help, all the affection, attentions, and encouragements, chances, and opportunities I have received in the process of my life constructing professional journey to build up a new life in this country. My attitudes were based on memories of my childhood, growing up feeling the safety of my loving and wonderfully guiding parents, learning from them, and also from teachers of my home country, including morality and humanity. They and the new impressions in building were my life, have helped my life in Minnesota to be formed and molded, along with my personality, to become an adjusting young man, taught me to grow, hopefully a useful member of the American society.
Thank you. I'm a little bit petite, so I'm going to move the podium. It's happened to me many times, although I'm very cautious to warn people that I don't think of myself as short. So in my mind, I'm like 6'11", or maybe more. Okay? So, and it's true. Okay? But thank you very much for coming. The show is just wonderful, and I'm so honored to be invited by my colleague Erica Lee as part of this panel of wonderful speakers. I'm here to learn something new as well. So to begin with, we know that last year, right? I'm not sure some of you have seen the series of documentaries that was shown on PBS. Which marks the 40th anniversary of the end of the Vietnam War. And there was a series of the whole month of April, and then it topped off with a premiere of the documentary America's Last Day, which shows, documents and shows the very last days when the South Vietnamese nationals were scrambling, at the U.S. Embassy, trying to get into helicopters, trying to get into ships, really trying to leave with the Americans because they had spent many, many years being loyal, right, and fighting on the side of the Americans. And throughout this whole month of educating the American public about what happened in Vietnam, and of course, in the documentaries, we see the Vietnamese, once they get on a ship, they were immediately taken into U.S. bases in the Philippines, and then, as Professor Erica Lee says, immediately granted asylum. And by December, just from April to December, right, 130,000 were already accepted to the U.S. as asylum seekers. What about the Hmong, right? Nothing. I didn't see any documentaries about them at all shown on PBS. And so this was the very first time, in fact, for me, as a refugee who came from Laos and who also witnessed, the Hmong events in Laos, to see, that these, the South Vietnamese nationals were actually rescued and taken directly into U.S. soils. That's not the case for the Hmong. There was no mention of the Hmong. But I was not surprised. In fact, I would be very surprised, if there was a mention of the Hmong. So what you see in the PowerPoint above here are two pictures, from the Vietnamese evacuation in Saigon, and then on your left, and then on the right is the Hmong evacuation from the secret base called Long Cheng, translates as Dragon Capital, Vang Pao's headquarters in Laos, in northern Laos. Both photos capture Hmong and Vietnamese people carrying their most basic life possessions as they're fleeing, right? As they're fleeing toward modern machines, which are emblematic of American technologies and a sign, of course, of Americans' superpower status, airplanes, ships, right? The plane and the ship in the photos are sites of hope for the refugees who aim to escape the ravages of war into safety and asylum. And I juxtapose these two photos for a reason. Now, if I didn't label the photos, you'd never know that one event took place in Laos and one in South Vietnam. I don't think so. For the ordinary eyes, the photos could have easily been interchanged. The Hmong crowd, with the C-130 plane in the background, could have easily been understood to be Vietnamese and vice versa. The people in these photos appear to be the same. They dress similarly, resemble one another in physical attributes. That is that they're Asians, dark hair, right? And they seem to have a similar historical experience with the U.S., right? By the sight of both of these groups of people fleeing toward, American superpowers of, American technology that's going to take them to safety. So they definitely have a proximity to American technology and power. We know that, with that showing. What is not apparent, however, is that once the individuals in these photos were classified as refugees, that is the Vietnamese in the Philippines, but the Hmong in Thailand, classified as refugees, their ethnic label as Hmong or Vietnamese would cause them to be classified into very different categories by the U.S. government. America is, as my distinguished colleague Erica Lee demonstrates in many of her work, a gatekeeping country. For the U.S., the Hmong would not be suitable for asylum. Moreover, while the South Vietnamese historical experience has long been recognized, and highlighted, that of the Hmong remains silent. The Hmong have been in the U.S. for 40 years. But it is very, very strange that last fall, when my book came out in the spring, and I was invited to give a series of book talks in areas in Wisconsin that have huge Hmong populations, like Wausau, Eau Claire, Wisconsin Rapids, Madison, and other areas. And I had, coming from the Hmong capital of America, right, which is right here in the Twin Cities, I had naturally assumed that because Wausau, and Eau Claire and other places also have large Hmong populations, that I could just dwell right in and start talking about the Hmong. And so, I thought, okay, I didn't need to give basic introductions, right? And I was wrong, because at the end of my presentation, one woman asked me if the Hmong were Lao. And if they were Lao, why did I refer to them as Hmong throughout my whole presentation? And then it occurred to me that they didn't know who the Hmong were, that the Hmong were actually, they're from Laos, but they're an ethnic minority group, from the mountains of northeastern Laos, and they're not Lao. Laos is ruled by the majority Lao ethnic group. So I was kind of shocked, because Wausau, especially, this was in Wausau, we've had, since the 1990s, we had elected Hmong officials as city councilors, as county representatives, and so I was like, wow, and these are their neighbors, and yet, there were people who didn't really know who they were. And so, this makes me realize that I can't take it for granted anymore. I can't just go across America, start speaking about the Hmong, and expect people to know who they are. That I need to, in fact, always give basic introductions. But why is that the case, right? Well, because the whole situation in Laos was not like South Vietnam. The whole situation in Laos was a total secret. And to give you an idea of how secret it was, the whole operation was run by the CIA, who, by the way, says it's, whether depending on how you analyze it's part or not part of our U.S. government, okay? Right? Depending on, plausible denial, Run by the CIA, a few CIA officers in Thailand. They're based in Thailand. And in fact, there was really only one CIA operative in Long Cheng. One guy who was allowed to remain there overnight. Everybody else, supposedly when it gets dark, they're forced to go to Vientiane or something, And that was Jerry Daniels. And that's how the secret was kept for a long time, So for the Hmong, then they developed this sort of special relationship, okay, this secret special relationship with the U.S. And this makes it much easier than later on for the U.S. to deny them asylum, right, because of this secret. In fact, most people in Congress didn't even know, okay, that the U.S. was in Laos. Right? That's how secret it was. And even today, obviously, right, there are still Americans who still don't know, that the Hmong were involved in Laos in the war. So let's very briefly look at this special relationship and look at, U.S. policies toward the Hmong, which it's probably very, very intriguing if we come right down to 2016, how the U.S. shift, right? First for the Hmong, then against the Hmong, then for the Hmong, then against the Hmong, and coming back. And a lot of these gatekeeping stuff, the ways in which they classify and reclassify the Hmong, reminds me a lot of what's happening in Syria, and the ways in which we are now serving as gatekeepers. How do we screen? Do we consider all Muslims as terrorists? Don't let them in, right? We've heard a lot of these going on in the news. But the special relationship with the CIA dates back to 1960, and in fact, if you look in the French era, it dates way back before that. How was this special relationship possible? Well, for the Hmong, what happened was that they are a Highland group who came into Laos very early on, and so therefore, by 1946, when the French succeeded in creating Laos as we know it for the first time, they were recognized officially in the Constitution as citizens for the first time. Recognized in paper, okay, but in actuality never really considered citizens, even up to today. They are, the Hmong still have ambiguous status in Laos as, at most second-class citizens in Laos. And so then during the French era, the Hmong had already sided with the French and created an army of like 9,000. And by 1960, of course, when the CIA came in, they already knew this history. Right? And they already knew that Vang Pao already had an army of 9,000 that was trained and equipped by the French. And so it was very easy then for the CIA to target Vang Pao and to recruit these Hmong. And in fact, they built this army even more. Historians say within a period of months, the army grew from 9,000, almost 10,000, doubled to 20,000. And then throughout the war, the number, Vang Pao commanded 20,000 regulars and 10,000 SGUs, or special guerrilla units, who are paid directly by the CIA. And so the Hmong sacrificed a lot, right, during this whole war period. Now, fast forward to 1972, the U.S. starts to, in North Vietnam starts to have discussions about ending the war. Guess who they didn't include, right? Laos wasn't even included in the discussion. So, there's no hope for the Hmong. And so in May 1975, several years, of course, we know North Vietnam now, looking back, was just waiting for the U.S. to pull out completely. They never intended, right, to keep the peace. And as a sign of that, immediately in 1972, Le Duc Tho and Henry Kissinger were both offered the Nobel Peace Prize, and Le Duc Tho refused his half. So this is sort of, gives us a sort of precursor to what's going to happen. So in 1975, then what happened is that once the U.S. was out, the communists started march toward Hmong Tianyans and received the evacuation then of the Hmong. And this is, another better picture of them with a, view of the airplane that is actually better. So the Hmong now suddenly finds himself in Thailand, and they were, to quote a lot of Americans, considered to be the best, most loyal fighting forces in all of Indochina, even better than the South Vietnamese who the Americans couldn't even trust, But now they find themselves sort of in this ambiguous status, right? Because they were considered too primitive, right, to be accepted into American society. This is how our government, does their gatekeeping. They're from the mountains. And this is despite the fact that from 1960 to 1975, I mean, if you look at, as I said, the photos of Hmong in South Vietnamese, they look the same, right? And they have the same proximity to U.S. technology. And in fact, Hmong men had been, recruited to fight. So they could drive cars, jeeps, tanks, fly T-28 fighter jets, okay? So everything that we know, which would, go against this argument that they are primitive, already exists. But still, the U.S. government says they're too primitive to be allowed into America. It wasn't until the Jerry Daniels himself, as well as some CIA operatives, U.S. officials, began to, really threaten to expose the secret in Laos. And to shame the U.S. government and to hold them accountable for what's happened to the Hmong, that they start to accept the Hmong. So from, as Erica Lee said, April to December, already 130,000 Vietnamese, but only a few hundred Hmong were allowed. And those few hundred were people who were closely tied to Vang Pao, who came directly to Montana. Now, U.S. policy toward Hmong refugees has really, really changed. Even after they transcended this primitive idea, there's other issues, right? Other gatekeeping issues. Beginning in the late 80s, early 90s, even though Hmong refugees were still coming out into Thailand, the U.S. quickly reclassified these individuals as economic refugees, okay? Not political people, who want political asylum. And of course, the Hmong were, by this point, coming out of the jungle. They had lived in the jungle since 75, chased around by the communists. So it was very easy, during the interview process to easily persuade them to say, yeah, we ran out of food, we were starving in the jungle, so yes, we came. Okay, they ran out of food, economic refugees, right? So this becomes sort of another gatekeeping to deny them asylum, and to ship them back into Laos because they were no longer considered political refugees. And so today, the issue of the refugees is still ongoing. I just wanted to close by, and we can have a little bit of discussion too at the end. It's still ongoing. We all think the war in Vietnam is over, that the refugee situation, particularly with the Hmong, has been resolved, and it has not. The Hmong remain, there are still thousands and thousands of Hmong that remain in Thailand, as illegal aliens. In the meantime, we know that since 9/11, U.S. policies have shifted toward the Hmong in America, right? We know that Vang Pao himself was arrested in 2007 for, under the Patriot Act, which is that you can't commit, terrorist acts abroad. The Hmong themselves were reclassified as one of the terrorist groups, and so, all these things are happening, and I think because of that, the situation, the refugee situation, the Hmong situation in Thailand, and especially in Laos, is not going to be solved, because of the shifting policies. The most loyal allies are now terrorist groups. Just to update, I will close by saying the Hmong political figures did succeed in removing, having the U.S. remove them from the category. But they are very angry, right, that they had to be placed under that category. And I'll end here, and again, we can have discussions after our last speaker. Thank you.
Good evening. First, I want to thank Erica and Immigration History Research Center. And I want to thank the Somali community in Minnesota and globally who allow us to invade their privacy over the years, over a decade. Erica mentioned earlier about the Bush Fellowship. I want to thank them. I don't normally advertise anything, but I have to say this one. Forgive me. After a decade of documenting Somali migration globally, from a refugee camp in Kenya, Malta, Greece, Italy, Latin America, Minnesota, Ohio, and so forth, we have collected over 100,000 images, photographs, and texts, and we are very pressed to archive those images and stories. With that said, so this fellowship will help me to think through an archive, and with that note, I wanted to say Immigration History Research Center archives, I know she's here, for us will be working together as the fellowship continue, that the community will have an archive. In my lecture, I want to echo what my colleague says. The title, I've been struggling with this title. I've been on the road and seeing refugees and issues from social media and fieldwork on my own independent research from the area that we see today, whether it's in Macedonia, whether it's in Austria, whether it's in Greece, but those are the places I work. So I call it the cryptic laws and policies, refugees and immigrants. So in this lecture, I intend to briefly touch on the scope of the Somali migration within the context of a global migration, then elaborate the most common refugee routes, Somalis, into African countries, Europe and the United States, and Central and South America, just very briefly. And in particularly, I will hope to shed some light on the legal challenges that the refugees face globally, in particular not only Somalis, but globally, in a different locality, as well as the various responses and reactions by the state policymakers and the international body tasked supposed to provide services to them. I will also briefly outline the challenges through the specific cases that have encountered. These current issues, and I'm sure everybody will say this is nothing new, it really needs to be paid attention from, and maybe in a different angles, rather than just the conversation of two people having it, but from a political and policy aspect. I wanted to mention, just recently, several days ago, there's a boat that sank coming to Italy. The report goes back and forth. Majority of Somalis, Ethiopian, and Eritrean, 400 people died. So with that sense, I've been thinking about how I can tie up all this together, given the lecture's title and what my friends are saying. So I will use three voices of a human being that I can mention their names, and that will tie up in my argument. Why do I say the cryptic laws and policies, refugees and immigrants? And the first person I will use their name is Sahra Ahmed, who was detained in Nairobi, and she wasn't only the one, but thousands of Somalis are detained in Nairobi in Kenya 2014, although we know some are in a refugee camp, and historically, some Somalis are Somali Kenyans. And then I will use, and this is the center of my argument, the state thought, the notion of a state thought, by Abdi Malik Sayyid, unanimously considered one of the very best thinkers of migration. Unfortunately, I'm not known beyond the Francophone world. Then I will use an article just to quickly to mention Jeff Crisp, a research associate, University of Oxford, Refugee and Studies, and held a high position in the United Nations for High Commission for Refugees. To begin with, Sarah, she was arrested in Nairobi, and by the idea of a state thought, the idea that all of us, we are in a certain situation that we are narrated for the state thought. So Sarah, when she was arrested, she's a Somali Kenyan, not a refugee, was born in Kenya. Her grandfather and her father was born in Kenya. And here's her poem. She says, strangers are not simply those who are not known in this dwelling, but those who are in the very proximity already recognized as not belonging, as being out of place. Abdi Roble said, to think about migration, always think about the state that thinks about the migration. Means, continue on to say, being a children of a nation state, of a national category we bear within us, which the state has implanted in us, we all think about migration. In the other words, about those who are others, or other than ourselves, they are, and through them, what we ourselves are, in a way that the states require us to think, and ultimately in the way that the state itself thinks. Just to add one more quick, in the state through the creates a mode that of thinking about everything is that all the domains to which is applied to in the same way that the state thought might as a result of its constantly repetition and its own strength. In that case means constantly the state. Sarah Ahmed was arrested by the state that who thinks Kenyan state, who thinks she's others. Although there are other people who look like her who are Somalis, but the state thinks Sarah, she's the others. And now, if I can just quickly go to a Jeff Crisp, it was an article published by the Open Democracy recently, March 21st, 2016, he says, from the mid-1980s onward, there was a steady rise of the numbers of asylum applications being submitted in the world's more prosperous countries. Their response, you have to look at the state that thinks about migration. Their response was introduce a succession of measurements internationally designed to curtail that movement. It is not the person in the Twin City who walks around and canvas that can have those kind of thoughts. And even if they do, they cannot do anything with it. But the state can do something with it. And it says, in response, which is introduced to successions of measurement internationally designed to curtail the movement, include new visa requirement, pre-boarding documentation checks, sanction on airlines, and other transport companies carrying people without a requisite papers, and increased fortification of a land border and other restricted areas. So now, in the issues of the EU and the deal with Turkey, I didn't go to Turkey, but I worked in Greece. So the people I was documenting, either they come from Yemen, northern Somalia, Yemen. Then I will encounter in Greece, and you can understand how far that is. Or the other part is people come from Sudan, way up north in Libya, and then I will meet them in Malta, we'll meet them in Italy. So this is the idea. In that time, Gaddafi and the Italians were making deals, and you have this four fortress of countries, which is Greece, you have Malta, you have Italy, and you have Spain, that's supposed to block. And here's how to deal with it, the state thought. First is the establish of a safe zone in countries of origin. You hear that people should be taken back, either even taken to Turkey or even taken to other countries. Limited needs and ability of people to seek asylum at the states. The second is that the migration management. The migration management and offshore process agreement that usually involve cooperation between industrialized countries and other countries doesn't have the same power, but will go along with it and agree with it. Third is to legitimize, then bring the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, International Organization for Migration, that they can legitimize. And recently we see the UNHCR pulled out from the deal the European Union and Turkey they were making. One is, for my own interest, I was always interested in aspect of migration, specifically in Somalis. Then when really this hit recent huge migration, then I started thinking about the relationship between colonialism and migration. If I can think through this, I'm sure there are other people who thought about it, but the idea of the sender countries in relationship to the receiving countries and what history intersect in colonialism. And that's something, I don't want to get into it, but that's something to think about. That's when you see, for example, when I look at Somali issues, when I see people in UK, how the UK treats Somalis in relationship at that moment, but in relationship to colonialism. That when the British were in Somalia, how were they treating the Somalis? Not good. In the same way, when I look at in Italy, which is I worked in Italy, and I can say the same thing in the Twin Cities. The idea of having the second largest Somalis in the Twin Cities, for me, is that all? That's it. I mean, what should I do? Jump around and say, oh, thank God? But the idea of the state thinking about the Somalis, the idea of, from what I say, from the state means culturally, religion, education, all the things that the state runs. I want to go, I have 2 minutes, wow. Just a quick, and the reason why I'm mentioning those 3 people I'm tying up is, first of all, you hear the Dublin regulation in 2003, which is the European Union met in Dublin. That means there's no asylum shopping, what they call it. That means you enter in Greece, you stay in Greece. If you show up in Sweden, you'll be deported. In Germany, temporary protection, which is similar to TPS here, that every year Obama has to sign or someone else has to sign. If not, you go back. That means your country you could be sent back. Cases in Greece, pushback, still going on, fingerprints, homeless, case of Malta, detentions, rejection, secondary migration, case in Central and South America, the idea of ununiformity of protection of refugee that doesn't come, the cases in the refugee camp in Kenya, which is I already touched on. Thank you so much.
So we have just a few minutes for conversation between the panelists, among the panelists, with you, the audience. I'm going to throw out one starter question, and then this is going to give you time to think about what question you want to ask yourselves. But what struck me between the 3 different presentations is the diversity of experiences. And I'm just, taking notes on some of the words that I heard. From László, he ended on a very uplifting note with words like affection, help, chances, opportunities. Mai Na's talk was titled Secrets and Silences, and she used the term gatekeeping and unresolved and targeting of populations. And Abdi titled his talk, or focused it on cryptic laws and policies, the role of the state when the migration when the state thinks about migration, it results in things like Fortress Europe and the fortification of borders. And he raised the question about what this big question: what causes migration, and specifically what causes refugee migration? What's the role of colonialism? So my job as moderator is trying to, put all of these different perspectives together and try to make or ask some, questions that might help us see some connections or continuities or contrasts. And the one thing that was in the background for me was the changing role of U.S. international relations, the changing relationships that the U.S. has had with each one of these different populations and their homeland countries, and how has that affected? What impact can we place on that for these different refugee experiences? So I guess I wanted to offer the panelists, not all of you have to answer, but to consider that question of U.S. foreign policy. How did the U.S.'s relationship with Hungary at that time, or more specifically its Cold War ideological and military battle with the Soviet Union, help frame the Hungarian refugee experience versus the different context with Laos and the Hmong people versus with the Somali diaspora? If any of you have thoughts about that.
Well, what I would like to point out is that, of course, when I left somewhere, from Hungary, the people's relationship within that very much society that where they told you just about everything, what to do and what not to do. And that's, I have to say, there were some aspects of that society and some things that they introduced that were good, but they were too far and too far in between. That is, they also went, and if anyone dared to say no to them or dared to criticize them, they oftentimes did not survive. They oftentimes, it was an absolute terroristic society, and it was nearly impossible to live in there. Now, we were listening to Radio Free Europe, we were listening to the Voice of America radio stations, and of course we took everything for granted, and we thought that, my God, there is another place in this world where there is freedom and where is individual freedom with which you can get to somewhere within that society. And I believe that I was influenced by this when I escaped, and I came to the United States, and I did not, how should I say, I did learn for several reasons. I did learn the language very hard, and in Austria, I was in the same room with a minister who wanted to come to Canada and wanted to learn, and he felt that learning the language was a very important step, not just because you are going to get a job or something, but you get to know, by knowing the language, you get to know the thinking of the people, the thinking of society, so you can make decisions whether you wish to join or you don't wish to join. And this you may find this interesting. I asked him how much he was learning. Oh, he said, I am really trying to learn about 200 words a day. I said, 200 words a day? I said, wait a minute. We were very good friends, basically, and we oftentimes walked every single day and argued about the presence of God and so forth, and he was not always very pleased with my arguments. But he did say that, he said, yeah, I am trying to, I said, listen, Father, he was a minister, and so the father was I was giving him a punch in the side. I said, God won't take it very good from you if you are exaggerating. Well, he said, I said, well, he said, well, I really tried. Give me that book. I mean, the 200 words. He knew 194 out of the 200. I was, punched in the chest back, but he was giving an enormously good example for me. So when I came here, I really wanted to learn the language more also. And because I got from his principle, I hung on to his principle where he said that it was important to get to know society and how you are going to, you can do the fitting yourself if you are going to, if you know the society well enough where you really want to get to into. I'm sorry if I went too far.
I think it's I think for the Hmong case, when we look at U.S. policies, in particular, we can highlight the issues of accountability. And fortunately, just this past weekend, I had interviewed, one of the Hmong leaders who had worked really hard to remove the terrorist label. So if you look at it, right, the trajectory and the history of the Hmong is that, you got the secret staunch allies in the 60s, and although not recognized, beginning to gain recognition in the 90s, right, as officially, being conferred by Congress with honor. Especially, memorials and plaques being raised across the U.S. and then the 2000 Veterans Bill, which says, Hmong veterans and their spouses and their widows can become U.S. citizens, without taking the citizenship exam in English. They can do it in Hmong. So there's an exception for Hmong. And then allowing the Hmong to hold, build a monument, in 2006 in Sheboygan and one in California, multiple ones in California. And naming schools after Vang Pao and things like that. And then suddenly, right after, especially after 9/11, there's shift. There's a shift. And for a while there, in 2006, 2007, the Hmong were labeled suddenly as terrorists, and then Vang Pao was arrested, right? And just speaking from the Hmong political activists, for them, they look at U.S. policies and some of the issues that we see currently going in right now, with the election, surfaces. And for them, the question is, how do, as a country, right, have we lost, the basic values like honor, right, loyalty to our allies, remembering our history, right? Remembering our debt, to certain people, certain countries, certain groups in the world, and have we just sort of delve into this situation where we just do whatever, suits our purpose, without being accountable, right? And so a lot of the Hmong activists, they felt that the U.S. has sort of devolved into this country now that is no longer accountable. And they use the Hmong example, to demonstrate that. Like, look at the same Congress that passed the 2000 Veterans Act for the Hmong, then suddenly turns around and labels them as terrorists. And so what happens to accountability? What happens to honor, to loyalty? To the old value words that we as a nation state associate with ourselves, right? This is a big issue in the Hmong community and among the Hmong activists right now.
You know, we can open it up for one or two questions.
Sure.
I think we have time for one, possibly two questions. And you can raise your hand and just project really loudly, or a mic will come. No?
Thank you. I want to say thank you, first of all, to all our speakers this evening. It's been an enlightening evening, and thank you very much. This question is directed to Dr. Lee. Thank you for your comments, and boy, I would be the first to agree that the Hmong have been victims of the vagaries of American foreign policy. I was wondering if you could also speak briefly about some of the challenges within the community. For example, some of the challenges brought by groups like Neo Home, groups also that represent other governments, the Thai military perhaps being the most prominent, and even some of the very sad examples, say recently of Mr. Seng Shong, who was recently arrested for wire fraud. So any of those things you care to talk about.
So we're talking about U.S. accountability, right? And certainly the responsibility, we have to hold, I think, Hmong leaders also accountable. Definitely for a long time, you know, Vang Pao's focus, probably right up until he died. He, you know, a few months before he died, he was announcing that he was going to go back to Laos. So, you know, I think his policy has always been to retake Laos, and despite what people are saying now, they're crediting him for bringing the Hmong to America. In fact, that wasn't true. For a long time, he was encouraging the Hmong to remain in Laos for political reasons, right? Because as long as there's instability in Southeast Asia, then he can, you know, always have a political reason to go back and dabble in the politics in Southeast Asia. And so, yes, definitely, you know, his groups, Neo Home, have accountability for some of the sufferings of the Hmong, because he directly did encourage many Hmong to remain in Laos. And in fact, when the Hmong were labeled, you know, across the board as a terrorist group, you know, there were Hmong political factions who are not part of Neo Home said, you know what, it's fine if you label Neo Home as a terrorist group, okay, right, like you do Al-Qaeda, but geez, you know, all of Hmong, what's wrong with you, you know? And so definitely there are groups that hold them accountable as well. And the issue is complex, right? On the one hand, you know, you've got the U.S. Perhaps not being accountable, you know, at certain junctures, and you've got also, you know, Hmong leaders themselves within the society who also exploit, you know, the vulnerabilities of Hmong people who want dreams. The situation that Paul Hilmer mentions, the arrest of this guy, he exploits the Hmong dream, and I love that. That's the title of my book, by the way. So he exploits the Hmong dream, right? The aspiration for a sovereign nation state where the Hmong would no longer be oppressed. And he started to ask people to donate money. And in fact, I know people who individually did donate money, Hmong elders. You know, they still have this dream. And ultimately, he was, you know, arrested for fraud. And many claim, although we don't have the evidence to say, many claim that Vang Pao's group, Neo Home, for many years was also extorting Hmong, you know, using that dream as well, you know, that we would go back and find a country. And so there's controversial issues in the community, definitely, you know, so there has to be accountability in the community. And the history is controversial. You know, it's hard for people to speak out, even today in the community, against certain power groups. But I think increasingly, you know, people are speaking out, and they are, you know, being more open about those situations.
I just want to add just with that, just describe. I think I'm not a politician, nor am I sometimes understand the whole concept of things. How do you have one leg on the dance floor and then one leg up? So I'm just going to say straightforward. It's much easier for me. The foreign policy for the U.S. has been horrible for Somalis. Absolutely horrible. It's wonderful to see that community being welcomed. From my experience in Minnesota and Ohio and all of the places that I've traveled, but from perspective of back home, has been horrible. Now, in my lecture earlier, the state that thinks about migration, we have to think about the state that thinks about migration. Then it's much very simple for me to answer this question, which is how the state thinks about the Somalis here in the Twin Cities. And we all know that. So I don't have to walk you through to that. So, working in the refugee camp in Dadaab, I see the young people, 25, 26 years old, who graduated from the UFM, get 3 months for training how to make a decision who should come here and who should not, which is the UNHCR used to make that decision. So when I met them in the refugee camp, it was just disheartening to meet these people. In the evening to have with coffee, has no understanding of what refugee life is. And those kind of policies, we're not talking about the big one that you see, but the very little one that has been placed all over. And the other thing is look at the relationship with other countries. That should tell you something.